The morning they auctioned her father's farm, she stood at the back of the crowd and did not cry. She had cried already in the weeks before, when she had understood what the ledger meant and what Ingram intended to do about it. She had cried and then she had stopped, the way you stop a leak by packing it with whatever is on hand. And since then she had been practical in the way that grief sometimes makes a person practical, because there is nothing left to protect. Ingram had hired a man from Millhaven to run the auction, someone who did not know her father's name or the particular way the South Field flooded in April, and this man stood on the wagon bed and called out items in a voice that had no more feeling in it than a fence post. Her father's team harness, the seed drill, kitchen table she had eaten every meal at since she was 4 years old. She watched a woman she had never seen before press her fingers into the grain of that table and nod once and hold up her hand, and she watched the table go. She stayed at the back. She did not bid on anything. She had nothing to bid with. The farm went last, as it always did, and Ingram read out the amount of the debt in a tone she recognized from the months when her father had still been alive and fielding his letters, a tone that managed to sound reasonable and final at the same time. The crowd shifted. Someone coughed. A man she didn't know, standing to her left and a little behind her, said something quietly to the man beside him, and the man beside him said nothing back, which meant it wasn't a question. She watched the opening number go up once, then twice. On the third bid, a voice from somewhere near the lumber wagon said a number that was $50 above the debt, and the crowd went quiet in the way it goes quiet when something unexpected has entered the room. The man who had spoken was leaning against the near wheel of the lumber wagon with his arms folded and his hat pulled forward against the November light. She had not noticed him before. He was not a man who made himself noticeable, medium height, work-worn coat, the kind of face that did not offer much without being asked. He did not look at her. He was looking at Ingram the way a man looks at arithmetic he has already done. Nobody bid higher. Ingram called it twice and then called it done, and the crowd began to move, the way crowds do when the main event has ended, and there is nothing left but the walking away. She did not move. She stood in the thinning yard and watched Ingram approach the man, and she watched the man reach into his coat and produce an envelope, and she watched Ingram count what was inside, his lips moving slightly, and then stop and look up. The man said something she could not hear. Ingram looked at her, then back at the man, then at the envelope again. He closed it and put it in his breast pocket and walked toward the house, which was his now, and the man by the lumber wagon straightened up and pulled his coat closed and walked toward her. "There's a remainder," he said when he was close enough. "Over the debt. Ingram's holding it. You can collect it at the bank in town by Thursday." She looked at him. Why? He did not seem to find the question difficult. He considered it the way you consider a question about weather, not as a thing that requires defense, just as a thing that requires an answer. "Didn't seem right," he said, and that was the whole of it. She did not thank him. She wasn't sure what to say to a man who had just bought her father's land and then arranged for money to be sent to her, as though the two things were unrelated. She thought about what the remainder would come to, and whether it was enough to keep her through winter somewhere. And she thought about where somewhere might be, and the thinking took her to a bad place, so she stopped. "You have people nearby?" he said. He was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at her the way you look at a situation you are trying to understand the dimensions of. "Not close enough," she said. "Not before the roads go." The roads would go in 2 weeks, maybe 3. It was already the second week of November, and the sky over the ridge had been doing what skies do in this country before they make up their minds to snow. She knew this country. She had grown up reading it. He looked once toward the road, then back. "I've got a farmstead 8 miles north, room enough, not much of one." He said it the way a man offers a fact, not a favor, until the roads open in spring, if that serves. She thought about it for the length of time it takes a person to look at a bad option and a worse option and identify which one is which. "I'll work for my keep," she said. "I know," he said, which was not quite an agreement and not quite a dismissal, and she wasn't sure she could explain the difference, but she felt it. They left within the hour. She had 2 bags. The smaller one was heavier. The farmstead was 8 miles north, and looked it. The lane from the road was 2 ruts in frozen grass, and the house at the end was a story and a half, weather-gray boards, a barn set crooked to it like an afterthought. A dog she hadn't seen came around the corner of the barn and stopped and looked at her, and then looked at him, and then went back the way it had come, which she thought was a reasonable response. He brought her bags in without comment. There was a second room, a lean-to addition off the kitchen that had been used for storage and still smelled of it, and he had put a cot in it at some point between proposing this arrangement and arriving home. She did not ask when. She was still in the mode of taking stock. The way you take stock of any place you have ended up in before you decide what it asks of you. The kitchen was functional in the way that a man's kitchen is functional when no one has corrected it in several years. The shelving was low on one wall and too high on another. The water pail sat in the wrong place for how traffic moved through the room, and she moved it on the second morning, without saying anything about it, and he came in and found it and did not move it back. She cooked what she could with what was there. The larder was thin but organized, which told her something about him, and the root cellar had more in it than the kitchen suggested, which told her something else. She was beginning to collect these details, the way a person collects information about whether they have to live in. Not out of sentiment, just out of necessity. He was out most of the day, which helped. He worked the way men in this country work in November, with a patient economy, always moving but never hurrying, doing the things that need doing before the cold makes them impossible, and then the things that need doing regardless. She watched him from the kitchen window, without deciding to watch him. She was looking at the yard, that was all, and he happened to be in it. He came in at midday and ate what she put in front of him and said thank you and went back out. He said thank you every time, which she had not expected. Not because the words were elaborate, but because they weren't. He said them the way he said everything, plainly, like a man who means what he says and does not feel the need to ornament it. By the end of the first week, she had found the mending basket behind the door and mended 4 things in it without being asked. There was mending that needed doing, and she had hands, and she was there. That was the whole logic of it. He noticed the mended things the way he noticed the moved water pail, without remark, without reversal. She began to understand that this was how he operated, that he took in information and filed it and did not feel compelled to describe the process aloud, and she found this, to her own surprise, restful. The snow came on the 3rd week of November, 2 days earlier than she had guessed. A hard fall that laid 8 inches in a night and made the yard into something unrecognizable by morning. She was up before him. She had been up before him most mornings, not from obligation, but from habit. From years of farm mornings that had built the rhythm into her before she was old enough to question it. She found the broom inside the door and swept the porch clear. The wind had drifted it against the northwest corner, and she worked from there, outward, the cold pulling at her face. Somewhere in the barn the horses were moving, one of them knocking against its stall in the rhythm that meant it wanted water. She did not go to the barn was his. But she swept the path from the porch to the barn door. And when he came through the kitchen and found her coming back in, he looked at the swept path without looking at her and said nothing. And she said nothing, and the morning went on. There was a woman in town, Mrs. Palfrey, the wife of the man who ran the feed store, who had a way of looking at situations and then looking at you as though the situation had said something unflattering about your character. She came by on the 2nd clear day in December with a covered pot and stood on the swept porch and looked at the swept porch and then at the house and then at her when she opened the door and said, "I heard about the auction. I thought I'd see how you were getting on." She thanked Mrs. Palfrey for the pot, which turned out to be a decent beef barley, and showed her in and made tea and answered the questions that were asked out loud and did not address the ones that weren't. Mrs. Palfrey left after 40 minutes, with the expression of a woman who has found less to report than she had hoped. When he came in that evening, she had the beef barley on the stove. "Mrs. Palfrey," she said, tilting her head toward the pot. He made a sound that covered his feelings on the subject adequately and sat down, and she put a bowl in front of him and they ate without much discussion. And she thought that this too was something she was beginning to understand about him, that he knew which conversations were worth having and which ones you could let go past without loss. She had expected to feel like a guest. She did not feel like a guest. She couldn't have said when this changed because it didn't change all at once. It changed the way the cold changed. In degrees, in increments so small you noticed only when you looked up and found you were somewhere different than where you'd been. She started to know the house. She knew which board near the stove creaked and which window let in air at the east corner and needed the gap stuffed with rag in January, which she did with a strip of flannel cut from a piece she found in the mending basket. She knew that he checked the sky every morning before he pulled his boots on, out of habit or superstition or something between the two. She knew that the dog, whose name was Hatch, she'd learned this the way you learn most things about him, by observing rather than asking, would accept her presence in the barn by the 4th week, but would not eat from her hand for another 3 after that. She did not take this personally. She thought about her father often, not with the raw kind of grief that had happened already and would happen again later, she knew. But for now what she had was the quiet kind, the kind that just sits with you in the kitchen while you're doing something ordinary and doesn't ask anything of you. She thought about the table the woman from the auction had taken. She thought about whether the woman had children who ate at it now, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she could bear this. Not easily, but she could bear it. In January, she found the seed catalog on the shelf above the window, the current year's, well thumbed. She sat with it one afternoon when the light was good and turned the pages with the attention she gave to anything that might tell her what she needed to know. When he came in, she was still reading it. He pulled off his boots and poured his coffee and stood there a moment before he said, "Something in there interest you?" "The early peas," she said, "and the kitchen garden section. You've got good southern light on that side of the house." He looked out the window at the side yard, which was presently under 3 feet of snow. "It's decent," he said. "Ground's probably clay under that first layer. You'd want it worked before planting." She was looking at the catalog, not at him. "Ash would help, and manure from the barn if you can spare it." She felt him look at her. Not sharply, just the way a person looks when they are paying attention. Then he said, "I've been meaning to get more out of that side yard." She turned a page. "It's worth the effort." Neither of them said anything else about it. The catalog sat on the shelf until February, when she found herself making notes in the margin in pencil. Small, practical notes about timing and quantities, the kind you make when you are planning for a season and not merely reading about one. She did not remark on this. She did not expect him to. February was the hard month. It always was. The cold that settled in then was not the dramatic cold of early winter. It was the sustained kind, the kind that moves in like a long-term tenant and doesn't apologize for the inconvenience. She had grown up knowing February cold and she did not fear it, but she respected it the way you respect any force that can outlast you if you stop paying attention. He brought extra wood in without being asked, more than the day needed, and she understood that he was thinking ahead the way she was thinking ahead. And she found a certain comfort in this that she did not examine too carefully. There was an afternoon in the 3rd week when the wind came up, and the light went flat in the way it goes flat before a blow, and she came in from the porch and found him already at the table with the lamp lit, writing in the account book he kept on the top shelf. She made tea and set a cup by his hand, and he looked up and said, "Thank you," and she sat across from him with her own cup, and outside the wind worked at the eaves and the house held steady, and neither of them said anything for a long time. She thought, this is what it is. She did not finish the thought past that. One evening he came in later than usual, and she could see by the set of his shoulders that something had gone wrong out there. One of the horses, she would learn later, had cut itself badly on a wire near the east fence, wire that had been buried under the snow since October. He said nothing about it at supper. He ate and then sat with his coffee and said, "The fence on the east side is going to want attention in spring." "I saw the wire," she said. "When the snow pulled back last week, I meant to say something." He shook his head, not as a correction, just as a man shaking off something he had already decided not to carry. Wasn't your wire to find? She looked at her hands on the table. It is now, she said. He looked at her then. She felt it before she met it. His face did not do anything dramatic. He just looked at her the way he looked at most things. Steady, careful, without expectation. And she held it for a moment, and then they both looked at something else, and supper finished the way supper finished. But the fence was between them after that. Not as a problem, as a known thing, something named. The thaw did not come all at once. It never did in this country. It came the same way the cold had come. In degrees, in the drip off the eaves at noon and the refreezing by nightfall, in the particular smell of air when it begins to soften, the smell of things opening that had been closed since October. She stood at the window one morning in March and watched a strip of bare ground appear at the south edge of the yard where there had been snow the day before. And she felt something in her chest she could not name cleanly. Not relief, not apprehension. Something that held both without being either. He brought the wagon around on a Thursday. She heard it from the kitchen. The sound of the wheels on ground still half frozen, the creak of the traces. She looked out the window and saw him checking the wheel hubs with the methodical attention he gave to anything mechanical, pressing his thumb into joints, testing for give. He did not come in to tell her. He did not need to. They had both known without saying so that the question of spring had been pending since November. The arrangement had a named end, and the thaw was the end. She went to the lean-to room and pulled her 2 bags out from under the cot. She opened them. She packed the smaller one first, her mother's thimble, which she had kept in the pocket of her good skirt all winter. A book she had brought and not read. 3 letters from her cousin in Halifax that she had answered and not sent. She folded her spare dress into the larger bag and pressed it flat with her palm, and then stood there with her hands on the fabric. Through the wall, she could hear the particular silence that follows the stopping of a wagon. She closed the larger bag. She picked up both of them. She carried them through the kitchen and out the door and down the 2 steps to the yard, and the cold that comes off newly bared ground in early spring rose up around her boots, and she stood with her bags and looked at the wagon and at the road beyond it, and at the ridgeline to the north where she knew the shape of it now, the way you know the shape of a face you have been living beside without meaning to memorize it. He was standing at the wagon wheel. He looked at her when she came out. He did not come forward. He did not reach for the bags. She looked at the wagon. She looked at the house. Kitchen window. The curtains she had made in December from the flour sacking she'd saved, plain and a little uneven at the hem, letting the light through in the particular way she had come to expect on winter mornings. The boot scraper she had moved 6 inches to the left because it made more sense there. The woodpile he had stacked higher than the rail every week since November, always a little more than the day strictly required. She turned around. She went back up the 2 steps and through the door and set the larger bag down beside the wall, where boots went when a person was staying in for the day. The smaller one she held a moment longer, then set beside it. She straightened up and looked at the kitchen, the way you look at a room you are seeing clearly for the first time, because you almost did not come back to it. Then she went to the stove and built the fire up properly, the way you build it when you are planning to cook. He came in behind her a moment later. She heard his boots on the step, the door, his coat on the peg. "East fence wants looking at before you bring the cattle through," she said. He was quiet. She could feel him looking at the bags by the wall. She kept her hands at the stove. "I'll get the wire," he said. "I'll take the south end. The ground's softer there. It'll want more posts." "All right," he said. She heard him go back out. Then she heard the sound of the wagon moving, not away from the yard, but back toward the barn, the creak of it going the other direction entirely, and then the particular quiet of something that has been put away where it belongs. Outside, the strip of bare ground at the south edge of the yard had widened since morning. The light through the kitchen window was the early spring kind, thinner than summer, but with something in it that winter light never had, something that made the room look like what it was. She put the kettle on. She began pulling things from the larder for supper, not looking at the window, not looking at the door, doing what her hands had learned to do in this kitchen, in this order, in this light. Outside, somewhere past the fence line, Hatch was making the sound he made when he found something worth investigating in newly thawed ground. A door opened and closed in the barn. Smoke from the chimney went up straight and steady in the still air, the way it does when there is no wind and someone inside is planning to be there for a while.